Have you ever stopped and, really thought about how different you act, how different you feel when you're totally alone versus when you're swept up in a huge crowd? Like, think about a big concert or a massive sports game or even a protest march. Doesn't it sometimes feel like the crowd itself just takes on this whole separate life, a personality almost? Powerful, exciting, maybe even a little bit scary sometimes. Totally different from just the sum of people in it. Well, that exact thing, that transformation that happens to us inside a group, that's what we're really digging into today. We're doing a deep dive into a really, really foundational piece of social psychology. It's a book that genuinely shaped how people thought, right across the political map, actually, and honestly, it still hits home today. Gustave Le Bon's Psychologie des foules, or in English, The Crowd. A study of the popular mind.
Yeah, and it's so much more than just, dusting off an old book. It's really about getting to the core of how we act together collectively, how that collective action has steered history, and maybe the surprising ways it still affects how we see ourselves, how we see society. So your mission for this deep dive, if you choose to accept it, is to really grapple with Le Bon's central ideas. Some of them are pretty confronting, actually, like what exactly happens to you, the individual, when you become part of a crowd? How do crowds think? Or, maybe more accurately, how do they not think? And what are the tools, often not rational at all, that people use to sway them? It's really a look under the hood at how groups work, and it forces you to question some basic assumptions about, group smarts and even your own autonomy.
Absolutely. And just to give you a sense of how big a deal this book was right from the get-go, think about this. It first came out in 1895. The version we're looking at is the 40th edition from 1937.
Wow, 40 editions in that time.
Yeah. It tells you something about its staying power, right? Dozens of reprints in just over 4 decades. And it was dedicated to Théodule Ribot, who was a major figure in French psychology back then. So it wasn't some fringe pamphlet. It was serious academic work from the start.
Right, positioning it firmly in the scientific debates of the day.
Exactly. And Le Bon's ideas were so groundbreaking, maybe even shocking to some, that the book got translated immediately into English, German, Arabic, Japanese, tons of languages right from the first edition.
That's quite unusual, isn't it, for such rapid, widespread translation?
It really is. And it tells you that people everywhere, across different cultures, saw something profound in it. Even if the ideas seemed paradoxical or unsettling, they resonated. People clearly felt it helped explain the massive social changes happening around them at the end of the 19th century. So Le Bon kicks things off with this really dramatic statement right in his introduction. He just declares it. The modern age is the era of crowds. Full stop.
Quite a pronouncement.
Isn't it? And he argues that the really big shifts in civilization, the major turning points, they aren't primarily about things like, foreign invasions or kings being overthrown. No, he says the real changes come from much deeper, often invisible transformations within society. Shifts in opinions, in basic concepts, in the core beliefs people hold.
So internal changes are the real drivers, in his view.
Exactly. And for Le Bon, the power of the people, the fouls, as he calls them, that power is surging. It's fundamentally changing politics, the way states are structured. He saw it as leading to this era of profound social turbulence. And this isn't just a side note for him. It's the defining feature of his time. His main idea is that the unconscious action of crowds, not their reasoned decisions, but their collective impulses, has started playing this considerable role, a bigger role than ever before in history.
Unconscious action taking precedence over conscious individual thought. That's a big claim.
It is. He argues it's basically replacing the deliberate, conscious activity of individuals as the key characteristic of the age. It's a huge shift. And he illustrates it by saying, look, for centuries, what the crowds thought barely registered. Politics was decided by elites, right?
The traditional view.
But now, he says, the voice of crowds has become preponderant. It dictates to princes how they should act. That's a massive flip from the old way of doing things, where the collective, often unthinking impulse of the masses now dictates policy more than the wisdom of individual leaders.
And if we connect that to the bigger picture he's painting, Le Bon really saw his time, the late 19th century, as this incredibly critical moment. Not just change, but like deep transition. Even anarchy, as he puts it.
Anarchy, wow.
Yeah. He believed the old foundations, religious beliefs, political structures, social norms, the things that had basically held civilization together were crumbling. Now, he wasn't blind to progress. He acknowledged that science and industry were creating totally new ways of living and thinking. That's undeniable. But alongside that, He sensed this profound uncertainty, this almost fear
Huh.
about what would replace the old crumbling certainties. It's like a vacuum of belief.
And the crowd rushes into that vacuum.
That seems to be his implication. He goes deeper, too, stressing this isn't just about, superficial tweaks to society. He talks about the destruction of religious, political, and social beliefs that form the basis of our civilization. He's literally describing the pillars falling down, faith, hierarchy, order all shaking. And here's the bit that really makes you pause. Le Bon suggests that in the middle of all this breakdown, all this uncertainty, the power of crowds is, quote, the only force that is not threatened. And ironically, as prestige, its influence will actually grow.
So the only stable thing is the unstable crowd. That sounds problematic.
It does raise a huge question, doesn't it? What kind of stability can you possibly build if the only rising, enduring force is this often chaotic, impulsive collective? It points towards a future that's maybe inherently unstable, driven by forces that are much harder to predict than individual reason.
And Le Bon is pretty blunt about what he sees as the crowd's main role in this whole process, isn't he?
Yeah.
He doesn't exactly flatter them. He straight up says, crowds have an inherently destructive role.
Yeah, he's not subtle.
Not at all. He argues, look, civilizations are built carefully, right? On rules, discipline, on moving from basic instinct towards reason, from chaos to order. But crowds, he warns, they tend to pull things back the other way, towards a return to certain periods of confused anarchy. They basically dismantle what took ages to construct. He gets quite specific, characterizing them as these unconscious and brutal multitudes that just dissolve old civilizations.
Brutal multitudes, strong language.
Very. But he adds a twist. He suggests it's not always totally random. Often these destructive crowd forces are guided by a small intellectual aristocracy towards their destructive goal.
So there's a manipulation angle, too. A few minds steering the many.
Exactly. It suggests a more calculated element behind the chaos sometimes. And he uses this really stark analogy. He says a civilization needs fixed rules, a discipline, the passage from instinct to reason, the foresight of the future, a high degree of culture. Conditions, he says, that are totally inaccessible to crowds.
Okay.
Without those things, he argues, societies are left vulnerable and crowds act only as purely destructive agents, like microbes that activate the dissolution of debilitated bodies.
Wow. Like a disease breaking down a weakened organism. That's a powerful image.
It really is. It paints crowds as this almost biological force of decay, speeding up the end of a declining society.
And despite seeing them as this incredibly powerful rising force, Le Bon makes a really critical point. The actual psychology of these crowds, it's hardly studied.
Which seems crazy given their importance in his view.
Right? He sees it as this massive oversight. He really criticizes politicians, legislators, professionals for basically ignoring or just totally misunderstanding how crowds think and behave. And this ignorance leads to, bad laws, ineffective policies, basically failed governance because it's not based on reality.
He gives that interesting example about Napoleon, doesn't he?
Yeah, he says even a genius like Napoleon, who understood the French crowds brilliantly, sometimes completely misread the psychology of crowds from different cultures, different races, as he put it, which shows just how complex and varied these collective minds can be.
So even the best can get it wrong.
Exactly. And the implications of this ignorance are huge, according to Le Bon. He insists that understanding how crowds work is absolutely of the utmost importance for anyone in power, for statesmen, for legislators. Without grasping the real, often irrational drivers of collective behavior, any attempt to lead or govern is basically flying blind. You'll constantly be surprised by their impulses, their swings, their potential for destruction. It's really an urgent call for a whole new way of thinking about governance in this era of crowds.
Okay, so if crowds are this big, rising, potentially destructive force, we need to be clear on what Le Bon actually means by a crowd.
Yeah.
And he makes a really important distinction right away. It's not just any old group of people milling about.
Right, that's crucial.
He says a numerical agglomeration of individuals is not enough to form a psychological crowd. 1,000 people waiting for a train, that's not it. People crossing a busy street, not what he's talking about.
So what makes a difference then?
He says the formation of a psychological crowd involves these special characteristics that fundamentally change the people within it. When individuals are momentarily gathered under certain specific conditions, like sharing a powerful emotion, a common goal, being exposed to the same stimulus, something happens. Their normal individual characteristics, including those deep, stable, ancestral traits common to their people, they get joined by a whole new series of characteristics, sometimes very different from those of the race.
A new set of traits emerges just from being in the group.
Exactly. And this whole combination, this temporary merging, creates what he calls a powerful, momentary collective soul. And here's the really key part. In this psychological crowd, your conscious personality vanishes.
Vanishes completely.
That's his term. The unconscious parts of the mind take over. He talks about a disappearance of cerebrospinal life and the predominance of unconscious life.
Okay, cerebrospinal life sounds a bit dated, but what's he getting at there?
Yeah, it's 19th century language, but basically he means the higher brain functions, conscious thought, critical reasoning. Individual, will they get suppressed? Instead, people revert to more primitive, automatic, instinct-driven responses. Your intelligence, your usual feelings, they get transformed. You might become better or worse, more heroic or more brutal than you'd ever be alone.
So it's a fundamental shift in your psychological state.
A profound shift. It's like your individual identity gets temporarily submerged.
And this leads him to what he calls the psychological law of their mental unity, a really core concept for him. He explains that when people gather under these specific circumstances, they don't just stand near each other. They actually acquire this collective soul. Their feelings, their ideas, they all start pointing in the exact same direction. It's like individual minds syncing up into one powerful temporary consciousness.
A single mind emerging from many.
Sort of, yeah. But crucially, it's not just the average of everyone there. It's not like adding up opinions. He says it's a new temporary entity, a whole new being, almost. He uses this biological analogy, which is quite striking.
The one about cells.
Right? The psychological crowd is thus a provisional entity composed of heterogeneous elements, momentarily combined. Just as the cells that constitute a living body form by their reunion a new being, manifesting characteristics very different from those each cell possesses. So, just like different types of cells create a complex organism with totally new abilities, different individuals merge into this psychological crowd, creating something new that behaves differently than any of them would alone.
That mental unity, that collective soul, that's the defining thing.
Exactly. That's what gives the psychological crowd its unique power and often its unpredictability.
Okay, but what kind of soul are we talking about here? Is it wise? Creative? Le Bon seems less than impressed. He argues that within this collective soul, the intellectual aptitudes of the individuals and consequently their individuality are effaced.
Effaced. Wiped away.
Yeah. The heterogeneous is submerged in the homogeneous, and the unconscious qualities dominate. So all the unique smarts, the critical thinking skills each person might have, they get drowned out, leveled down. And what comes to the surface are the basic, unconscious, instinctual drives.
So it's a regression, intellectually speaking.
That's exactly his argument. And he's really blunt about it. He claims crowds are inherently intellectually inferior to the isolated individual. It's a radical challenge to ideas like the wisdom of the crowd, isn't it?
Absolutely. He's not just saying people in crowds act silly. He's saying the process of collective thought itself dumbs things down.
He claims their decisions are often imbecilic, that they lack foresight, nuance. They possess mediocrity, he says, not intelligence. He even throws Voltaire under the bus, kind of. He says Voltaire's spirit, the epitome of reason, actually represents the average mind, the spirit of all the world, and therefore the mind of the crowd.
Ouch. So the crowd levels down to the average, or maybe even below.
That seems to be his point. He talks about assemblies of perfectly ordinary, decent men making collectively imbecilic decisions. He concludes crowds are simply incapable of performing acts requiring high intelligence.
It forces you to really question those romantic notions about the will of the people, doesn't it? He's pointing to a fundamental vulnerability in group thinking.
Definitely. It's a much darker, more critical view of what happens when we gather en masse.
Okay, so if being in a crowd leads to this diminishment of individual intellect and the rise of the unconscious, the next big question is why? Why does this transformation happen? Why do smart, rational people suddenly change so dramatically? Le Bon points to a few key factors.
Right. What drives this shift?
Well, the first big one, and this really touches on something deep about human psychology, is this sentiment of invincible power. Just being part of a large group, a mass of people, gives the individual this feeling of being unstoppable, powerful, almost godlike maybe.
Like you can get away with anything.
Pretty much. It allows people to yield to instincts they'd normally keep tightly controlled when they're alone and identifiable. And crucially, he stresses the role of anonymity. The crowd is anonymous, and consequently irresponsible. That feeling of personal responsibility, it just evaporates.
Ah, the safety and numbers idea, but taken to an extreme.
Exactly. It removes the brakes. Suppressed impulses, aggression, wild enthusiasm, destructive urges, they can all come surging out because the individual feels shielded, unaccountable.
Okay, so feeling powerful and anonymous is step one. What else? Le Bon brings up this idea of contagion, which sounds a bit like a disease spreading.
It does, and that's very much the metaphor he uses. He calls it a phenomenon of hypnotic order. He observes how feelings and actions can spread through a crowd with incredible speed and intensity, almost like catching a virus.
You see that, don't you? A wave of panic or sudden anger sweeping through a group.
Precisely. He notes that sentiments and acts are, quote, contagious to such a degree that the individual in a crowd readily sacrifices his personal interest to the collective interest.
Right.
People get caught up in the moment, swept along by the collective tide, often acting in ways completely contrary to their individual beliefs or self-interest. Critical thinking just gets overwhelmed by the shared emotion.
Okay, so invincible power, contagion. And then there's the third one, which he seemed to think was maybe the most important, suggestibility.
Right.
Suggestibility. Le Bon argues that when you're in a crowd, you lose your conscious personality and you become highly suggestible. You essentially obey all suggestions of the operator who has made him act.
The operator, like a leader or influencer.
Yeah, or even just the prevailing mood or idea within the crowd itself. Your own will, your critical judgment, it just fades away. He says your sentiments and thoughts are oriented in the determined sense by the hypnotizer.
He actually uses the hypnotism analogy quite directly, doesn't he?
He does. He explicitly compares the individual in a crowd to a hypnotized subject. The conscious personality disappears, and you become, in his words, an automaton who has lost his will.
Wow. An automaton. That's a stark image.
Isn't it? And this extreme suggestibility leads to what he calls an irresistible impetuosity towards certain actions. People are easily spurred into acting, often impulsively and without thinking, which leads to that chilling line. The isolated individual may be a cultivated individual, but in a crowd, he is an instinctive being and consequently a barbarian.
So the crowd strips away civilization's veneer, leaving raw instinct.
That's the core of his argument there.
So given this state, impulsive, suggestible, almost hypnotic, it follows that crowds are mainly governed by these unconscious instincts. They're extremely mobile, constantly shifting, and incredibly impulsive, which means fundamentally you can't really guide them with reason or logic.
So appealing to the rational side is pointless.
According to Le Bon, yes. They respond primarily to excitations. Strong emotional triggers, powerful stimuli that bypass the thinking brain and hit them on a more primitive level. It's all reaction, not reflection. He gives that powerful example of self-preservation just vanishing.
Right, the idea that someone in a crowd can easily become a martyr.
Exactly. Normally protecting yourself is the most basic instinct, right? But in a crowd, fueled by a powerful belief or emotion, people can completely disregard their own safety, even embrace martyrdom for the collective cause.
Which you wouldn't typically do sitting alone contemplating it.
Precisely. The isolated individual, Le Bon says, could reflect. They have that capacity. But in the crowd, they are devoid of this aptitude. He uses that neurological language again, saying the higher cerebral activity is suppressed, and the person is operating more from the spinal cord, reacting automatically to stimuli without reasoned thought. It's a regression to a more basic response system.
And this lack of critical thinking, this suggestibility, it leads to another key trait he identified. Crowds are incredibly credulous, right? They'll believe almost anything. Yeah, excessively credulous is his phrase. They're simply incapable of critical thinking.
So fact-checking isn't really on the agenda.
Not even close. For the crowd mind, there's little ability to distinguish what's real from what's imagined, what's probable from what's pure fantasy. If an idea or a story is asserted strongly enough, especially if it taps into existing emotions, it can take root as absolute truth, no matter how absurd it might seem to an outsider. He tells that amazing story about the French frigate, the Belle Poule.
Ah, yes, the collective hallucination example. Tell us about that.
Well, apparently, during a storm, the sailors got convinced they saw another ship in distress. This initial suggestion, fueled by fear and the shared situation, just snowballed. They started vividly hallucinating, seeing masses of men on this phantom boat, even hearing a great confused noise of voices, crying out, a full sensory experience.
But there was nothing there.
Nothing but some branches torn from the coast, according to the rescuers who arrived later. It was a pure collective hallucination. Le Bon uses it to show how a crowd can literally create its own reality based on suggestion and shared emotion, completely detached from objective facts. They saw what they expected or feared to see.
And he connects this to stage magic too, right?
Yeah, he mentions psychologists like M. Davy who could easily fool audiences into believing in supernatural events using simple tricks. Why? Because in that crowd setting, people's normal spirit of observation and critical spirit had vanished. They were primed to believe.
So easily fooled, easily swayed. What does this do to their emotions? Are they nuanced, subtle?
Hardly. Le Bon argues that sentiments in a crowd, good or bad, it doesn't matter. They take on this double character of being very simple and exaggerated.
Simple and exaggerated. Yes.
Yeah. All the shades of gray disappear. Everything is seen in block, as he puts it. Black or white, love or hate, no complexity, no nuance allowed.
And this gets amplified.
Massively. He says this exaggeration is fortified by suggestion and contagion. An idea gets floated, the crowd approves, it spreads like wildfire, and each repetition, each person catching the feeling, makes it stronger and more extreme. It's a powerful feedback loop.
Which explains the intensity of crowd emotions.
Exactly. And he notes that the violence of these sentiments is often worse in heterogeneous crowds. Crowds made up of all sorts of different people thrown together. Why? Because of that absence of responsibility we talked about. Anonymity.
The feeling of impunity.
Right. The certainty you won't be held accountable unleashes those primitive instincts, those violent passions that are normally kept in check.
Which leads directly to another characteristic he highlights: intolerance and authoritarianism.
Because they only deal in these simple, extreme feelings.
Precisely. Crowds know only simple and extreme sentiments. They either accept an idea completely or reject it completely. There's no room for discussion, debate, or considering alternative views. This makes them, in his words, inherently intolerant and authoritarian.
You're either with us or against us.
Exactly that mentality. He connects this to the nature of strong beliefs in general, saying religious convictions, for example, are always intolerant and exert a truly despotic empire over souls. He sees the same dynamic playing out in political crowds. And he draws that distinction between Latin and Anglo-Saxon crowds based on his 19th century perspective, of course.
Right, attributing different tendencies based on race and culture.
Yeah, suggesting Latin crowds have this paradoxical mix of wanting independence but needing immediate enslavement to a powerful belief. He points to the Jacobins during the French Revolution, or even the historical Inquisition, as prime examples of this authoritarian intolerance driven by absolute conviction.
So it's a pretty bleak picture overall: impulsive, credulous, intolerant, potentially violent. But then Le Bon throws in a curveball, doesn't he? He says crowds aren't always immoral.
Right, that's the paradox. It's not all negative. He acknowledges they can actually be quite susceptible to morality. They can display amazing qualities like abnegation, disinterest, and equity, self-sacrifice, fairness.
So they can be capable of great good and great evil.
That seems to be his point. It's a complex picture. He says crowds are capable of great devotions and great disinterestedness. They can be genuinely heroic.
Which seems to contradict the barbarian idea somewhat.
It does, and it's one of the fascinating tensions in his work. He uses the example of the September massacres in 1792 during the French Revolution.
Ah, the prison massacres. Horrifying stuff.
Truly. But Le Bon points out that the individuals involved in these horrific acts were often ordinary, maybe even devout, law-abiding people in their daily lives.
So how could they commit such atrocities?
Because within the crowd, driven by a powerful collective fervor and a sense of righteous purpose, however twisted, their individual morality was suspended. They acted for what they perceived as the collective good, even if it involved monstrous cruelty. Le Bon notes specifically that personal interest is rarely a powerful mobile among crowds. It is almost exclusively present in the isolated individual. In the crowd, people can sacrifice themselves or their usual morals for the group's goal.
So the crowd unlocks both the capacity for incredible self-sacrifice and incredible brutality.
Exactly. It's a double-edged sword, amplifying both the best and worst of human potential.
Okay, so if crowds operate mainly on instinct and emotion, how do they actually process ideas? How do beliefs take root in this collective mind? Le Bon is very clear. Crowds don't engage with ideas like individuals do through, say, careful reading or logical analysis.
So you can't just present them with a well-reasoned argument.
Not effectively, no. He argues that for an idea to penetrate the crowd mind, it must be simple and presented under the aspect of images. It needs to be vivid, easily pictured, emotionally resonant. Think slogans, symbols, powerful stories, not complex theories.
So complexity is the enemy.
Absolutely. Complex, nuanced ideas are basically inaccessible to the crowd mind. Any idea, no matter how sophisticated or important it might be originally, has to be stripped down, simplified, almost caricatured to be understood by the masses.
He even gets a bit critical of major belief systems when they get filtered through the crowd, right? He does. He says things like democratic ideas, Christian ideas, social ideas of today. When adapted for crowds, they lose their elevation and grandeur. They become, in his rather harsh philosophical judgment, rather poor errors. He's suggesting the very act of simplifying them for mass consumption fundamentally degrades their intellectual content.
Interesting. So if they don't use logic, how do they reason? You mentioned images. Yeah, he says crowds reason by images. They are struck by images, and one image triggers another, often based on association or emotion, not logic.
Like a chain reaction of mental pictures.
Exactly. It's more like a dreamlike flow of association than a structured argument. And this leads to a major problem. They struggle to tell the difference between subjective and objective, between imagination and reality.
So if it feels real, it is real to the crowd.
Pretty much, he states plainly, they are not capable of reflection nor reasoning. They do not know the improbable. If an image is powerful enough, vivid enough, it becomes their reality, regardless of facts.
Which makes controlling those images incredibly important for anyone wanting to lead them.
Absolutely. Le Bon says the true art of governing is understanding the art of impressing the imagination of crowds. He argues that all the huge historical events, the rise of major religions like Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, big upheavals like the Reformation or the French Revolution, even current events, there are all consequences, direct or indirect, of powerful impressions produced by the imagination of crowds.
So history is driven by collective imagination, not rational planning.
Largely, in his view, it's a very different take on what moves history forward.
And this leads him to that really strong statement about reason's role, or lack thereof.
Oh yeah, he doesn't mince words there.
He states it flatly. The crowd does not reason, and is consequently not influenced by reasoning.
No room for doubt there?
None. He argues their reasoning, if you can call it that, is primitive. It's based on associating things that might seem similar superficially, but have no real logical link. This leads to conclusions that often seem absurd or incomprehensible to a rational observer.
So trying to persuade them with logic is just futile.
That's his conclusion. He says orators who know how to actually sway crowds understand this intuitively. They don't bother with logical arguments or evidence. No, they appeal directly to sentiments, to emotions, to the imagination. They bypass the critical brain entirely.
Those complex logical arguments, the mathematical consequences founded on syllogisms, as he puts it.
Totally foreign to them. They just don't compute. He gives that example from French politics in 1887.
Right, the official trying to use logic on the Chamber of Deputies.
Yeah, and Le Bon notes that despite the logical case being made, it was popular opinion, the crowd's sentiment, that ultimately carried more weight. It shows the disconnect.
Okay, so if reason is out and images and emotions are in, what's the fuel that really keeps the crowd going?
He talks a lot about illusions, doesn't he? He really does. He argues that crowds have always lived on illusions. And crucially, those who know how to give them illusions can easily be their masters.
Illusions as a tool of control, and maybe even a necessity for existence. He looks at history and sees religious illusions, political illusions, social illusions as fundamental forces that have built civilizations. They provide hope, meaning, a reason to endure hardship.
So we need these illusions.
Le Bon seems to think so. He says, from the dawn of civilizations, peoples have always been influenced by illusions. In his own time, he saw socialism as the latest, last powerful illusion, fulfilling the same psychological need for the masses as older faiths did.
And science can't kill them off?
Apparently not. He notes rather cynically that scientific demonstrations have not stopped the progressive march of illusions. He contrasts this with the Enlightenment philosophers who tried so hard to destroy all these illusions with reason, hoping to liberate humanity.
But Le Bon's take is different.
Yeah, he concludes those illusions are actually indispensable. Without them, people lose their way, fall into despair. Truth might be harsh, but illusion offers comfort and purpose.
It's quite a challenging thought that maybe we're better off, or at least more functional, living with certain collective fantasies.
It really is.
And this all circles back to the impotence of reason when faced with strong feelings. Le Bon says, it is not even necessary to descend to primitive stages to ascertain the complete impotence of reasoning when it has to struggle against sentiments. You don't need to look at savages, he implies. Just look around you. Even in sophisticated societies, when strong emotions are involved, reason just doesn't stand a chance.
Emotion trumps logic every time for the crowd.
That seems to be his bleak assessment. He muses, almost sadly, human reason is not without doubt our guide. Then he asks, should we dare to say it, it would be wrong to lead humanity into the paths of civilization with ardor and harshness where chimeras have raised them. Those chimeras being the illusions, the collective fantasies.
Exactly. He finishes that thought. Daughters of the unconscious that lead us, these chimeras were probably necessary.
Wow. So our guiding forces, the things that build civilizations, might actually be born from irrationality, from collective dreams, not logic.
That's the implication. Reason is a weaker force than we like to think, especially when the crowd gets involved.
Oh, yeah.
So if crowds are driven by these powerful emotions and illusions, what happens when these solidify into really strong convictions?
Huh?
The kind that make people act, sometimes in extreme ways. This leads to one of Le Bon's most provocative claims, I think, something that really changes how you might look at political movements or intense social beliefs.
Which is?
He argues that fundamentally, all popular beliefs, political or social, take on a religious form.
A religious form, even if they're totally secular, like political ideologies.
Exactly. He's not necessarily talking about God or organized religion. He's talking about the psychological structure of the belief, how it functions in the mind of the crowd.
Okay, so what are the characteristics of this religious sentiment, as he calls it?
He lays out a few key things. First, there's adoration of a being, real or imaginary, to whom a crowd attributes a mysterious power. This could be a deity, sure, but it could also be a charismatic leader, or even an abstract concept like the nation or the revolution.
Okay, an object of worship.
Right. Second, submission to the commands of this adored being, unquestioning obedience. Third, the impossibility of discussing dogmas. The core beliefs are sacred, absolute. You can't debate them.
Sounds familiar.
Doesn't it? Fourth, the desire to propagate these dogmas, a need to spread the faith, convert others. And finally, a tendency to consider as enemies all who refuse to accept them. That classic us versus them.
Intolerance built in.
Absolutely. He adds that within these belief systems, the supernatural and the miraculous are easily found. People readily accept things that defy logic if it fits the narrative. And it's fanaticism, that intense, unreasoning zeal that fuels everything, pushing people to extremes.
And he directly connects this religious structure to intolerance and fanaticism.
Yeah.
They go hand in hand.
Inseparable in his view. Because the beliefs are absolute and unquestionable, crowds readily practice intolerance and authoritarianism. There's simply no room for dissent. Disagreement becomes heresy, something to be stamped out.
He gives some historical examples.
Yeah, he points to the Roman Empire, where emperors were worshipped almost like gods. He argues the empire wasn't just held together by military force, but by this widespread religious admiration, this shared civic faith.
So belief was the glue.
A powerful glue. And then, maybe more chillingly, he looks at the French Revolution. He says, the Jacobins of the Terror were also fundamentally religious.
Even though they were often explicitly anti-clerical.
Yes, because their devotion to the revolutionary ideals, liberty, equality, fraternity, took on that same absolute, dogmatic, unshakable quality. And they enforced it with ruthless intolerance, executing perceived enemies of the faith, just like historical religious persecutions.
So the structure of belief is the same, even if the content changes.
That's his core insight there. And here's another fascinating layer he adds. He argues that even the most powerful rulers, the most absolute despots, they would actually be powerless to just create or impose these kinds of deep religious-like beliefs on people.
So a dictator can't just invent a new religion for the masses.
Not according to Le Bon. He argues it's the popular soul, the collective unconscious of the people itself that generates these powerful convictions. They bubble up from within the crowd, and then they gain this almost unstoppable force, compelling action in ways no top-down decree ever could.
Interesting. So the power originates from the collective, not the leader imposing it.
Often, yes. The leader might channel it or articulate it, but the belief itself has deeper roots in the collective psyche. He uses examples like the Protestant Reformation, the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, the Reign of Terror, these massive, often violent upheavals. He sees them all as phenomena of the same kind.
Driven by the same underlying psychological mechanism.
Exactly. Driven by the emergence of new, powerful religious beliefs, whether actually religious or political, social, that are so potent they compel people to commit acts of extreme violence and sacrifice in their name. It's a sobering view of where that revolutionary energy truly comes from.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the immediate psychology of crowds, how they think, feel, and act in the moment. But Le Bon also looked at the bigger picture, didn't he? The factors that shape crowds before they even form.
Yeah, he called them remote factors. These are the slow-burning underlying forces that prepare the ground, you could say. They make the collective mind receptive to certain ideas and influences later on.
So what shapes this underlying psychology?
He points to several big ones. Race, which was a major concept in his time, obviously. Traditions, the passage of time itself. Institutions like government or legal systems. And education.
Quite a range of influences.
Definitely. Each one, in his view, plays a part in creating the deep-seated predispositions of a people's collective mind. Now, starting with the one he considered most fundamental, and we have to handle this carefully, given the context of his time, he places race at the first rank.
Right. This needs context. How did he define race?
For Le Bon, it wasn't just about biology in a narrow sense. It was more like the embodiment of a people's entire history and culture. The synthesis of all the past, he called it.
Okay, so a broader cultural historical concept than maybe we use the term today.
Yes, though still deeply problematic by modern standards, obviously. He believed this race profoundly shaped everything. The character, beliefs, institutions, arts of a people. It was the bedrock of their collective psychology.
And he saw it as very deterministic.
Extremely. He argued the power of the race is such that no element can pass from one people to another without undergoing the most profound transformations.
Meaning ideas change as they cross cultural boundaries.
Fundamentally reshaped, yeah. He believed that even seemingly universal ideas get filtered and altered by the specific racial or deep cultural characteristics of the group receiving them. So democracy might look very different or function very differently, depending on the underlying racial soul, as he might put it.
Okay. It's crucial to understand that's his 19th century perspective.
Absolutely crucial. We're reporting his ideas, not endorsing them.
Right. So after race, what's next on his list of remote factors? Traditions.
Yes, traditions. And again, he sees these as much more than just quaint customs. For Le Bon, traditions represent the ideas, the needs, the sentiments of the past.
The collective memory.
Exactly. He calls them the synthesis of the race, the distilled experience passed down. And because of this deep connection to identity, he considers them the true guides of peoples, silently steering their present actions and beliefs.
Which would make them hard to change.
Incredibly resistant. He points out that even massive upheavals like the French Revolution, which aimed to sweep away the past, ultimately couldn't just instantly break the hold of tradition. People cling to them, often unconsciously.
So history weighs heavily on the present.
Immensely. The most tenacious ideas are the traditional ones, he states. It underscores his view that societies are shaped more by their accumulated past, this inertia, than by immediate rational arguments or revolutionary fervor. Then there's the factor of time itself, which he sees as more than just clock-sticking.
How does he view time's role?
He calls it the true creator and the great destroyer. It acts slowly, subtly. Time prepares the opinions and beliefs of crowds, letting ideas gradually take root, evolve, and spread over generations.
So ideas need time to mature in the collective mind.
Precisely. He argues, certain ideas realizable at one epoch are not so at another. Why? Because the mental soil hasn't been prepared yet by the slow work of time.
Time builds the foundation for new beliefs to grow on.
Exactly. It accumulates the immense residue of beliefs and thoughts on which new ideas of an epoch germinate. He calls time the invisible master that slowly transforms everything.
Does he see it as a stabilizing force then?
Interestingly, yes. He notes the anxiety in his day about crowd uprisings and potential chaos, but then says, essentially, don't worry too much. The time charges itself with reestablishing the equilibrium. He believed time would naturally smooth things out in the long run. A somewhat optimistic view there.
Okay, so race, traditions, time. What about more concrete things, like institutions, governments, laws?
Now here he has a very strong and quite critical view. He argues fundamentally that institutions are the daughters of ideas, sentiments, and customs. In other words, they are not the causes of events, but their effects.
So institutions reflect society, they don't shape it. That goes against a lot of political thinking, then and now.
It really does. He directly challenges the idea that you can just design a perfect set of laws or a constitution on paper and expect it to magically change how people behave.
He argues people can't just choose the institutions that seem best to them. Instead, they create them to reflect their character, their deep-seated nature, shaped by race and tradition.
He uses the French Revolution again as an example of failure, trying to impose rational institutions that just didn't fit the French character, in his view.
And he contrasts different nations again.
Yes, using those same 19th century categories. He claims Latin peoples might create republics on paper, but they end up being chaotic or contradictory because they don't align with their inherent nature. Whereas Anglo-Saxons, he suggests, naturally create more stable republics because the institutions match their character.
Again, his framework, very much of its time. But the core point is that institutions have to emerge organically.
Yes, they have to grow out of the popular soul, otherwise they're just an ill-fitting suit, doomed to fail or cause problems. And finally, among these remote factors, he takes aim at education. And he's pretty scathing about the system he saw, particularly in France and other Latin countries.
What was his criticism of Latin education?
He found it demoralizing. Why? Because it was overwhelmingly theoretical, bookish, focused on memorization and abstract knowledge rather than practical skills, critical thinking and action, or building character and will.
Learning about things, not learning to do things.
Precisely. And he saw really negative consequences flowing from this. He argued it produced a large number of discontented individuals and agitators.
How so?
Because it gave people intellectual aspirations, made them disdain manual labor, but didn't equip them for practical life or provide enough suitable white-collar jobs. So you get this class of overeducated but underemployed, frustrated people, men qualified without being able to find employment.
And this leads to social unrest.
He believes so. He claims this system turns people into enemies of society, fueling revolutionary anarchist tendencies. He saw it as literally preparing Latin peoples for hours of decadence.
Wow. That's a harsh critique of the education system's impact.
Extremely. He contrasts it somewhat favorably with what he saw as the more practical, character-building Anglo-Saxon education systems, which he felt produced more adaptable, self-reliant citizens. Again, framed within his cultural biases, but a powerful argument about the kind of education a society provides and its long-term effects.
Okay, so those remote factors, race, tradition, time, institutions, education, they set the stage over the long term. But what about the immediate triggers? The tools leaders or influencers use right now to actually sway a crowd that's already formed or forming. Le Bon calls these immediate factors.
Right, the direct levers of influence. And he puts huge emphasis on the power of images, words, and formulas.
Not logical arguments, but words and images.
Exactly. He points out that the meaning of words isn't fixed. It changes from age to age, from people to people, and crucially, for crowds, the power of a word often has little to do with its actual dictionary definition.
It's about the feeling, the picture it creates.
Precisely. It's the impression it makes. He notes how politicians cleverly use this, often putting new things with old words, using familiar, comforting language to disguise radical changes that people might otherwise resist.
Like putting old wine in new bottles, or maybe new wine in old bottles.
Something like that, yeah. He gives the example of democracy. Arguing the word evokes entirely different images and expectations in, say, France versus the United States because of those deeper cultural differences.
So the word itself triggers a preloaded image based on the crowd's background.
Exactly. Words evoke images, and it's those images charged with emotion that have a great influence. He says effective orators understand this instinctively. They use simple language, short syllables, and powerful, resonant phrases, magical formulas, he calls them, that hit the imagination directly.
Bypassing reason again.
Always bypassing reason. And this ties straight back into his recurring theme of illusions, doesn't it, as an immediate factor?
Yes, he brings it up again here. It's clearly central to his whole theory.
He just hammers it home. Since the dawn of civilizations, peoples have always been influenced by illusions. These collective fantasies, religious, political, social, aren't just side effects, they are essential fuel. They prop up civilizations, inspire hope, make life bearable.
He really believed illusions were indispensable.
Absolutely. Illusions are indispensable, he states flatly. He saw socialism in his time as the main living illusion, providing that necessary collective dream.
And trying to destroy these illusions with facts is pointless.
Worse than pointless, potentially harmful. He notes how philosophers tried to replace illusion with truth, but concludes, peoples do not want to know the truth. They prefer the comforting illusion, the inspiring fantasy. Removing it leaves a void.
So if reason and facts don't break the spell of illusion, what does? Does anything?
Well, he does offer one thing, but it's a harsh teacher. Experience.
Experience.
Yeah. Le Bon states, experience is the only effective way to establish truth in the soul of crowds and destroy dangerous illusions. Only direct, often painful confrontation with reality can shatter a deeply held collective belief.
But that learning process is costly.
Incredibly costly. It requires gigantic and repeated experiences, he says. Think massive wars, revolutions, societal collapses. He points to the French Revolution again, decades of turmoil, millions of men lost, immense suffering, and still the lessons weren't fully learned immediately.
It takes a huge shock to the system.
A massive shock. He also mentions the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. The crushing defeat was a gigantic experience for France, a brutal awakening that forced a reassessment of national illusions. It just shows how resistant crowds are to changing their core beliefs without overwhelming, often traumatic evidence.
Which brings us back, inevitably, to the role or non-role of reason.
Right. Le Bon couldn't be clearer on this. He explicitly states, reason has no influence on crowds, full stop. And repeats, they are not influenced by reasoning.
It's like a mantra for him.
It really is. He sees crowds as fundamentally incapable of abstract thought and reasoning. Their judgments aren't reached through careful consideration. They are imposed and never discussed, accepted wholesale, without question.
So appealing to logic is just a waste of breath.
Worse, it's counterproductive. Orators who try to use logic do not affect the public. They actually lose all influence because their words lack the imaginative power, the emotional resonance that crowds crave.
Crowds respond to feelings, not facts.
Exactly. They're swayed by sensations, sentiments, and images, not logical arguments, those mathematical consequences based on syllogism, completely incomprehensible to the collective mind.
He sounds almost regretful about it.
He does, he adds, we should regret that reason is not the guide of crowds. But he presents it as an unshakable psychological fact, not something you can wish away. You have to deal with crowds as they are, not as you wish they would be. Okay, so if crowds are this impulsive, suggestible, unreasonable mass, how do they ever actually do anything coherent? How do they get directed? Le Bon argues they have an instinctive need to obey a master.
A built-in need for leadership.
Yeah, he uses that analogy again. They're like a herd of animals that simply cannot function without a shepherd to guide them. Left to themselves, they're just chaotic energy.
So leaders are essential to give them purpose.
Absolutely essential. Leaders, he says, can create faith and give an organization to the crowds. They provide the focus, the direction, channeling that raw collective energy towards a specific goal, however rational or irrational that goal might be.
And he talks about different types of leaders, right?
Yeah.
What distinguishes them?
He does identify a couple of main types, but the crucial thing he emphasizes is that what truly defines all effective crowd leaders isn't necessarily brilliance or morality. It's will, sheer force of will.
Willpower is the key ingredient.
Above all else. So the first type he describes are the men of action and strong will.
Okay, what are they like?
These are the ones with a powerful, continuous, and durable will. An iron resolve. They're often energetic, violent, bold. Think figures like, he suggests, Napoleon or Garibaldi.
Doers, not just thinkers.
Exactly. And interestingly, Le Bon notes they might even be of limited intelligence, but they possess this invincible strength of will. That's their superpower. Their ability to impose their vision through sheer determination is what commands the crowd.
So forced personality trumps intellect.
Often, yes.
Yeah.
Then there's the second type. The men of ideas and agitation.
How are they different?
These are often more volatile figures, nervous, excited, sometimes semi-alienated individuals, he calls them. They might be driven by intense convictions, often bordering on fanatical. They see doubt and inaction in others and react strongly.
Ideologues, maybe?
Very much so. But he notes their will is momentary. Unlike the men of action, their intense energy might burn out quickly, or they might lack the sustained force to consistently direct events. He gives Robespierre as an example, powerful at inciting, maybe less so at consistent long-term control, often consumed by the very forces they unleash.
So different styles, but what do they have in common?
The key shared trait, Le Bon says, is this irresistible fascination, a kind of charisma, a magnetic pull that draws the crowd in and makes them want to follow, regardless of the leader's specific type. Okay, so leaders emerge. How do they actually do it? How do they persuade the crowd, given that logic is off the table? Le Bon outlines three main techniques.
The toolkit for crowd control.
Pretty much. First up is affirmation.
Just stating things as fact.
Exactly. Pure and simple, devoid of all reasoning and all proof. You don't argue, you don't explain, you just state the idea forcefully, confidently, as if it's undeniable truth.
Like commandments.
Precisely. Le Bon points out that religious books and codes of all ages have always proceeded by simple affirmation, presenting beliefs as absolute givens. For the credulous crowd, that confident assertion is often enough.
Okay, so affirm first. What's next?
Repetition. This is absolutely crucial. An idea, once affirmed, has to be hammered home repeatedly, incessantly. Why? To drive it past the conscious mind and lodge it deep in the unconscious regions.
Wear down resistance through sheer volume.
Essentially, yes. Repetition makes ideas sink into the depths of our unconscious, he says. Over time, hearing the same thing again and again makes the initial affirmation accepted as a demonstrated truth, even though zero proof was ever offered.
Familiarity breeds belief.
Exactly. He quotes Napoleon again, supposedly saying, there is only one serious figure of rhetoric, which is repetition.
And we see this everywhere, right? Advertising, political slogans.
Le Bon points directly to advertising. He says, look how easily we're influenced. If we had heard 1,000 times that the best chocolate is chocolate X, we would imagine we had heard it frequently. And eventually just accept it as true, unconsciously. It's the constant exposure.
Okay, affirmation, repetition. And the third one is contagion again.
Yes, contagion comes back here as a method of persuasion too, building on the earlier discussion. It's the process by which affirmed and repeated ideas, along with their associated emotions, spread horizontally through the crowd.
Like that virus metaphor again.
Exactly. Spreading like a contagious microbe, beliefs, feelings, even specific behaviors catch on and ripple through the group. He notes it happens in animals too, suggesting it's a really fundamental mechanism.
And it fuels things like revolutions spreading.
Yeah, he uses the 1848 revolutions as an example of political contagion spreading across Europe. Simple imitation plays a big role, people just copying what others around them are doing or saying, often without much thought.
And it doesn't just happen when people are physically together.
That's a key point he makes. Contagion does not require the simultaneous presence of individuals on a single point. It can happen remotely, spreading through newspapers, pamphlets, literary manifestations, or simply opinions, reaching people far apart. Which sounds incredibly relevant to our digital age, doesn't it?
Eerily so. Okay, so affirmation, repetition, contagion. Is that the full toolkit?
There's one more crucial element that underpins a leader's effectiveness: prestige.
Ah, prestige. What exactly does he mean by that? Sounds a bit vague.
He admits it's a mysterious force. It's that quality that makes an individual, or even an idea or an institution, command respect, admiration, even awe. It evokes both admiration and fear, compelling obedience without needing logic or even force.
Like charisma, but maybe deeper.
Something like that. He breaks it down into two types. First, there's acquired or artificial prestige. This comes from external things: reputation, glory, fortune, or titles.
So status symbols.
Yeah, things like wealth, fancy uniforms, medals, official positions, things that signal importance and authority. They create an aura.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the other type?
That's personal prestige.
Yeah.
And this one is much more potent, much more innate. He calls it a faculty independent of any authority. It's like a magnetic power.
The itch factor.
Kind of. It's that almost hypnotic quality that makes a crowd submit instinctively, like a ferocious beast to its tamer, he says dramatically. He points to Napoleon again as someone possessing this personal prestige to an almost unparalleled degree.
So this type of prestige comes from within the person.
Yes, an inherent power to fascinate and dominate. Leaders with this personal prestige have an irresistible power. It's what truly allows them to govern hearts and minds, inspiring immense loyalty and sacrifice.
But he also says prestige is fragile.
Extremely fragile, because it's not based on reason. It can vanish in an instant. Once the magic is broken, once the admiration turns to doubt or contempt, it's lost forever.
And the crowd turns quickly.
Viciously sometimes. As Le Bon puts it, the mob despises, without discussion, what it stops admiring. The fall from grace can be swift and brutal once that mystical prestige evaporates. #outro. So, that was quite a journey into Gustave Le Bon's Psychologie du Fou. We've really unpacked how he saw individuals changing within a crowd, becoming more impulsive, incredibly suggestible, often losing their critical faculties. We've looked at how raw emotion, powerful images, and simple, repeated ideas tend to win out over careful reasoning when it comes to swaying the collective. Le Bon painted this really stark picture of an unconscious, shared psychology driving social movements and historical shifts.
Yeah, and what's really striking is how much of it still feels relevant doesn't it? Even though it was written well over a century ago. You look around today at political rallies, online movements, even just social media trends, and you can see echoes of the dynamics Le Bon described. That deep-seated desire for strong leadership, the way ideas spread like wildfire through repetition and emotional contagion, the power of compelling narratives or illusions over objective facts, that strange magnetism of prestige. These sources are still very much at play.
Absolutely.
So understanding these mechanisms isn't just, an academic exercise about the past. It feels like a pretty crucial tool for navigating the world we live in right now, which is so saturated with information. And let's face it, often driven by intense emotion. Recognizing these patterns might help us, be a bit more conscious about how we're being influenced and how we participate in collective actions ourselves.
That's a great point. It gives you a different lens to look through. So maybe here's a final thought to leave you with as you go about your day. When you encounter a strong group opinion or feel yourself getting swept up in a collective emotion, maybe online or in person, just pause for a second and ask yourself, how much of this feeling, this belief, is genuinely my own, based on my own independent thought? And how much might just be a whisper or maybe even a roar from those deep, powerful collective currents of the crowd that Le Bon described?